The war that most Americans remember had a front. It had lines on maps, armies advancing and retreating, named battles with named dates. It had the Normandy beaches and the Pacific Islands and the North African desert and the liberation of cities. It had a geography that could be explained in newsreels and illustrated in newspapers and described to the people at home in terms that organized the conflict into something comprehensible. There was another war that had no front. It had no fixed line between safety and danger. It had no geography except the open ocean. And the open ocean has no geography that means anything to the men who die in it. This war was fought in the North Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic approaches, and every sea lane that connected the American continent to the places where the fighting was happening. Because without those sea lanes, without the ships that moved through them, the armies on the fronts could not eat, could not shoot, could not stay in the field. The front that most Americans remember was made possible by a war they did not fully understand was happening, fought by men the military establishment did not fully acknowledge as soldiers. They were merchant sailors, and in the first years of the war, they died at a rate that exceeded the casualty rate of every branch of the armed forces. In 1942, before the convoy system had been properly organized, and the anti-submarine technology had matured, and the sheer industrial weight of American shipbuilding had begun to compensate for the losses, a merchant seaman crossing the North Atlantic was in more immediate danger than most men carrying rifles. Bill Bailey understood this before the war began. He understood it because he had been at sea since he was 15. A boy from the slums of Jersey City, whose family was Irish, and whose childhood was the specific kind of poverty that the American working class of the 1920s and 1930s could produce. The kind where wintertime ice cream meant pulling snow off the fire escape and putting condensed milk on it, where communion shoes arrived only because the nuns pressured the parish, where bread with salt or lard was the ordinary meal, and you did not think of it as deprivation because deprivation was simply the condition of the world. He had gone to school through the 4th grade. Then he went to sea. The sea took him everywhere. Ethiopia, where the marketplace meat was invisible under the flies. A dozen other ports in a dozen other countries where the same essential poverty expressed itself in different climates and different languages, and the same foundational question: how does this exist? How do people take this? He asked these questions as a young man, and the questions led him, with the specific logic that political consciousness follows in people who are paying attention, toward an understanding of the economic structures that produce the conditions he was witnessing. He was not in any formal sense an educated man. He was, in the precise sense that the word requires, an educated man. Someone who had assembled a coherent understanding of the world from the evidence the world had put in front of him. He had been in Hamburg in 1932, before Hitler had formally consolidated power, but after the trajectory was visible to anyone willing to look at it. He had watched the stormtroopers on the sidelines of the May Day demonstrations, standing there, jeering, throwing rocks, entirely confident in the direction events were moving. Back in America, people were telling themselves it was a passing fad, that the man might have a heart attack, that it was a bad dream you'd wake up from. Bailey was not telling himself this. He had watched the trajectory in Hamburg, and he knew where it went. By 1935, he was working at the National Maritime Union in New York. The German ocean liner Bremen was docked in the Hudson, the flagship of the German merchant marine, a symbol of the Third Reich's prestige in the waters of an American port. The Klieg lights that illuminated the swastika at the ship's bow were visible from Times Square, that specific red and black against the darkness, brazen in the way that institutions are brazen when they believe they have the permission of the powerful. An American seaman had been arrested in Hamburg for carrying anti-fascist materials. The word had come back that he was facing 20 years. Bailey and a group of men he had worked with decided to do something. The plan was what it was, not a strategic operation, not a carefully organized political statement, but the improvised action of men who were angry and 19 years old and had decided that doing something was better than doing nothing. They would go aboard the Bremen and take the flag. The execution was chaotic in the specific way that improvised actions involving multiple men, a moving ship, and opposing parties who are also willing to fight tend to be chaotic. A decoy, a rush up the bow, fists connecting with jaws, a fountain pen used as a weapon, blood on multiple faces, a detective assigned to monitor the demonstration who had the bad fortune to be beaten by the German crew while trying to identify himself as a policeman. Bailey got to the flagpole. He grabbed the swastika and pulled. It wouldn't come free. He pulled harder. A man below him had a switchblade and cut the line. The flag fell into the Hudson River. Then the police arrived. Then the arrest. Then the interrogation, in which a Jewish detective who had been badly beaten by the German crew failed to identify Bailey as the man he had seen tear the flag down, and then failed again, and then failed a third time. Not from any confusion about what he had seen, Bailey believed, but from the specific moral calculation of a man who had absorbed 2 beatings on behalf of the German shipping company's security and had arrived at a personal conclusion about whose interests he was willing to serve. The flag was gone. The story was in every newspaper in the country. The Bremen Six became a name that people knew. Goebbels issued an angry diplomatic statement. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York, who was himself the son of an Italian Jewish mother, assigned his most conspicuously Jewish detectives, men with names like Goldfarb and Ginsburg, to guard the German consulate. This was a precise and deliberate provocation, and it worked in the precise and deliberate way that LaGuardia intended. This, Bailey would say decades later, was 1935. The rest, as he said, you know. The rest took 4 more years to become official American policy, and another 2 years after that, before the institutional machinery of the American military had organized itself sufficiently to begin addressing the U-boat campaign with anything approaching effectiveness. In the interim, the merchant fleet sailed. The Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels built to a standardized design, turned out from American shipyards in a production program of unprecedented industrial ambition, were the material answer to the strategic problem. They were not elegant ships. They were built to carry things from one place to another, as much cargo as their holds would take, as quickly as the production line could launch them. They were slow, 10 knots in calm water, slower in the Atlantic winter swells that the North Atlantic convoy routes required crossing. They were armed with the guns that could be mounted on them, which were guns of limited caliber and limited effectiveness against the primary threat, which was not surface attack but submarine. The German U-boat campaign of 1942 and 1943, what the German Navy called the Happy Time, in a piece of military nomenclature that requires no translation, came close to severing the Atlantic supply line entirely. In the first half of 1942, U-boats operating in American coastal waters, where peacetime merchant traffic had not yet adjusted to wartime convoy discipline, and where the blackout regulations that would eventually deny the submarines their silhouetted targets were not yet fully implemented, sank ships at a rate that the shipyards struggled to compensate for. In some months, the tonnage lost exceeded the tonnage being launched. A Liberty ship departing an American port in the spring of 1942 was entering a sea where the odds of completing the voyage were genuinely uncertain. The men who crewed these ships were civilian mariners operating under federal authority but outside the formal structure of the armed forces. They were civilian mariners, organized through unions like the National Maritime Union, paid at union rates that the conservative press argued were excessive given that Navy sailors were paid far less, deployed into a war zone without the institutional structures of military service, but also without its protections. A merchant sailor who survived a torpedoing and made it to shore or to a rescue vessel had not been wounded in combat, by the official definitions of the period. He had experienced a maritime accident. The distinction had consequences for his medical treatment, his compensation, and the acknowledgement he would receive from the institutions whose supply lines he had been maintaining. Bailey went back to sea. He had spent the early war years behind a desk at the NMU, putting young men aboard ships, kids who had never been to sea, who signed on because the union was looking for warm bodies, and the ships needed crews and the ships had to sail. He watched them go out. He watched some come back. He watched others not come back. He came to a decision that he described, in retrospect, with the plainness of a man who had thought it through carefully. How dare I sit behind a desk and ask these kids to go out? He resigned. He went to engineering school. He got his certificate. He shipped out. His theater was mostly the Pacific, Okinawa, the Solomons, Leyte, the Philippines. He was on the first ship into Subic Bay when the bullets were still coming from the shore and the operational situation had not been fully resolved, and he and another mate took rifles from the ship's armory and went ashore with the infantry, wearing their merchant marine officers' uniforms with the gold braid that the GIs apparently decided not to question. The ship's captain was displeased. Bailey was less concerned with the captain's displeasure than with the situation in front of him. They were never torpedoed. This was not something that could be managed or planned for. It was the outcome of the same statistical lottery that every ship in a convoy participated in, where the variable that determined whether you went down was the intersection of the submarine's targeting solution and your position in the formation and the route the convoy was following, and a dozen other factors that the people on the ship could not see and could not affect. You sailed. You arrived or you did not. The men who did not arrive were not, by any meaningful statistical argument, less capable or less careful than the men who did. The convoy routes that kept the Allied war effort supplied are among the least celebrated logistics achievements of the war, partly because logistics is not the material of the stories that survive, and partly because the people who performed this work were not, in the institutional accounting of the period, soldiers. The Murmansk Run, the convoy route that brought American and British supplies north around the Norwegian coast to the Soviet port of Murmansk, a route that required passing within range of German air bases the entire length of Norway and entering Arctic waters where survival in the water was measured in minutes rather than hours, was one of the most dangerous sustained military operations of the entire war. In the summer of 1942, convoy PQ-17 was ordered to scatter by the British Admiralty, which had received intelligence suggesting a major German surface force was about to attack. The intelligence was wrong. The German ships did not sortie, but the scattered merchant vessels, stripped of their escort protection, were hunted over the following days by U-boats and aircraft. Of the 35 merchant ships in the convoy, 24 were sunk after the order to scatter. The merchant sailors who made the Murmansk run did so with the knowledge that these numbers were in the operational record. They made the run anyway. The supplies, tanks, locomotives, ammunition, food, were what stood between the Soviet Union and defeat on the Eastern Front, and the Eastern Front was where the weight of the German military machine was concentrated, and the outcome of the Eastern Front would determine whether the German war effort could continue. The men in the rubber survival suits that took half an hour to put on in water cold enough to kill in 10 minutes were not peripheral figures in that calculation. They were the calculation. Bailey was at sea when Roosevelt died. The ship's crew gathered. They signed a document. They were behind the new president. They would continue until victory. This was not a dramatic gesture in the way that wartime gestures are often described as dramatic. It was a working crew on a working ship deciding in the specific pragmatic register of men who had been doing a dangerous job for years, that the job was not finished and they were going to keep doing it. He heard about the atomic bomb through the radio, heard the word as Adam, he said, thinking someone named Adam had built a new kind of weapon, wondering who this Adam was. Then the correction came through. A city destroyed by a single device. He said, "That's great," at first in the immediate reflex of a man who understood that the weapon might end a war that had been killing people for 4 years. And then he said, something else. A feeling that he could not place his hand on, but that was there. That something was wrong. He could not name it in August 1945. He held it without being able to articulate it, and he kept it. After the war, the camaraderie disappeared. That was how he described it. The collective consciousness of saving tinfoil and tin cans and toothpaste tubes. The small material participation in a shared effort that had made ordinary people feel part of something larger evaporated. Everyone was out for what they could get. Everything changed. He noticed this the way he noticed everything, plainly, without particular bitterness, but with the specificity of a man who kept track of the evidence. He had spent his life being part of something. He had understood, from the Jersey City fire escape and the condensed milk snow and the Bremen flag and the North Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic, that the individual life was embedded in a larger set of conditions that the individual life could either accept or resist. He had spent his life resisting, in the specific vocabulary of a man who believed that collective action was the mechanism through which conditions changed. The union, the demonstration, the ship's meeting that signed the document, the 101 ways that people who share a danger and share a purpose can choose to act as a collective rather than as isolated individuals. He wanted, he said, to feel that if some man 10 years from then had halfway decent conditions, he had helped in some small way to make it possible. He wanted somebody to say somewhere that those poor sons of bitches took a beating back in the old days, that their names might not all be remembered, but that glory to them, or something like that. He said it with a laugh. The laugh was not self-deprecation. It was the laugh of a man who understood the gap between what he was describing and the language available to describe it, between the weight of what the merchant sailors had done, the tonnage they had moved, and the ships they had lost, and the water they had survived or not survived, and the inadequacy of the formal recognition that followed. The language he had was the language he had. He used it. He had pulled the swastika off the Bremen in 1935, with a switchblade and a dockside crowd of 10,000 watching, and dropped it in the Hudson. He had gone to sea at 15 because his world was small and the sea was larger. He had put young men on ships and watched them not come back and decided that sitting at a desk was not where he belonged. He had been on the first ship into Subic Bay with a rifle he had taken from the armory. He had been at sea when Roosevelt died and signed the document and kept going. The sea does not record the names of the people who sailed it. The war does not record in the places where official history lives the names of most of the men who kept the supply lines running. Bailey understood this. He understood it the way he understood most things, by looking at it directly and deciding what it meant, and filing it alongside everything else he had seen. Glory to them, or something like that. It was enough. It was what he had.